Thank you. I'm delighted to have travelled all the way from Whitstable, 5 miles away, to talk today. As usual, I have far too many slides, so I will try and stick to the time that's been given to me. But it may mean that I skip some as we go along. I just wanted to mention, yes, I'm doing research work on the nature of mindfulness. My own particular interest, I work on the early period of Buddhism in India. I work on, in other words, the Indian context. I look at the literature and the philosophy of both the Buddhist and the Brahmanical traditions and the ways in which they interacted with each other. So I work on a field that's generally called Indian philosophy, but includes within it Buddhist philosophy. But I've become interested in the whole question of mindfulness, which I'll say a little bit about. And I'm also involved in a research project with some colleagues from Cardiff University. Stephen Stanley's a critical psychologist, Peter Hemming's a sociologist, and Al Arat is a sociologist of religion, where we are attempting to map the provision of training for mindfulness within England and Wales. And within that, I'm sure we'll come up with some interesting things to talk about. Because, of course, mindfulness is all the rage. You can find it in healthcare systems. It's widespread use in the NHS, for instance, and other healthcare systems globally. It's being adopted within business and the economy, in the boardroom, particularly as a form of stress reduction and training on how to pay attention. As mentioned by B, it's being adopted in the US and Korean military in some contexts for the training of snipers and dealing with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's also been adopted or is being explored in the context of politics. We have, in the workplace, we have something called the Mindfulness Initiative in the UK Parliament, which is an all-party parliamentary group. And since 2013, 145 British MPs have taken an 8-week course on mindfulness. So it's become very, very popular, whatever this thing called mindfulness is. And I have some initial questions, which is, why has mindfulness, in quotes, become so popular today? And what circumstances in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have made mindfulness and the modulated control of attention so in demand? Herbert Simon, 1978 Nobel Prize for Economics, had the following to say: "What information consumes is the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, says, "We are moving from a world where computing power was scarce to a place where it now is almost limitless, and where the true scarce commodity is increasingly human attention." We find people starting to talk about a notion, a concept called the attention economy. And this is a quote from a book by Davenport and Beck, The Attention Economy, Understanding the New Currency of Business. And I've highlighted particular parts of this quote that are of interest to me. "In post-industrial societies, attention has become a more valuable currency than the kind you store in bank accounts. The problems for business people lie on both sides of the attention equation: how to get and hold the attention of consumers, stockholders, potential employees and the like, and how to parcel out their own attention in the face of overwhelming options. Understanding and managing attention is now the single most important determinant of business success. Welcome to the attention economy." And whilst this morning being at this session, I've noticed that I've got at least 7 emails that have arrived in my email account while I've been here. And of course I haven't bothered yet to check Facebook or Twitter or any of the other social media possibilities that are now available to us. In 2015, Microsoft commissioned a study internally It wasn't a peer-reviewed study, but it was a study within its own confines as a corporation. And it was called Attention Spans, and it made an argument, or it explored the idea that human attention is under threat or is transforming. That in particular, digital technology was changing the nature of human abilities to attend to things, to be attentive. Here in the advert for the study, can we have your attention please? Attention is evolving in the digital age. How brands think about it needs to evolve as well. Because of course what an advertiser, and this study was aimed at advertisers, what advertisers, the problem they have today is the proliferation of information through digital technology. So it's getting your product, your commodity, your whatever it is noticed. It's drawing the attention of others. So attention becomes important. Now in the study, it explores the idea that human attention is decreasing, the ability to stay attentive, and uses the example of the goldfish that has an attention span of roughly 8.5 seconds, suggesting that human beings are becoming less attentive. Now, within the context of the study, which I should underline is not a peer-reviewed study, so in that sense that there are many criticisms that one can offer for it, the suggestion was that whether attention spans are decreasing or not, the nature of human attention is shifting in a digital age to a kind of switching form of attention, where you have to switch between platforms, between your iPad, your computer, your telephone, your smartphone, and so on. All of these different things drawing your attention. So you have to learn to, if you like, multitask in that kind of context. Now I want to, having put that as a kind of background which we can think about, I want to compare some traditional Buddhist ideas of mindfulness, as we've come to call it, to mindfulness as it's used as a kind of modern secular therapy in the boardroom and so on. Now, those of you who know something about Buddhism will know that from a traditional point of view, mental training, or bhavana, which is the word that's often translated as meditation in English, involves two aspects to it. There is what's known as right concentration, Samadhi, also samatha, kind of calming practices. And the kind of aim of these kinds of forms of mental training is the cultivation of increasingly calm and concentrated mental states, which in Pali are called jhana, or in Sanskrit are called dhyana. And the ideal here is to move towards a situation where your consciousness becomes like a deep and undisturbed pool of water with no ripples, this kind of deep ocean, calm ocean metaphor. But there is also within Buddhist traditions the idea of right mindfulness, which is another step on within the Eightfold Path, the Pali word for which is sati, or in Sanskrit smrti. And this involves the cultivation of insight, or vipassana. Sorry about all the terms here. And here this is related to the idea of heightened attention and a greater awareness of reality. Now, in traditional Buddhist contexts, the most common representation of these two is that they work in coordination with each other. There are differences within the diverse debating traditions, but this is the predominant approach that you find. The mental training involves the coordination of concentration techniques, which are often associated in the Buddhist tradition with the techniques that the Buddha learnt in the 6 years before he became the Buddha, when he was trying out different kinds of ascetic and yogic practice. And then the cultivation of sati, smrti, as it's known in Sanskrit, the word that's usually translated as mindfulness into modern English. And it's through the latter that we lead to insight, or vipassana, which sees the true nature of reality. Now, concentration, the first part of that, the key elements of concentration, or samadhi, is traditionally at least, long, arduous training of the mind to be one-pointed or concentrated, the ability to concentrate one's mind. This also is simultaneously a calming of the mind, because the mind, as in the Buddhist tradition, is often described in an unenlightened state as like a monkey. It's the monkey mind which swings from branch to branch, which flits around, cannot stay stable on its object. Now, these kinds of techniques are usually represented in the literature as an increasing refinement of the mind, as an instrument for perceiving and understanding reality, a kind of deepening of it. And the early stages of that practice often involve focusing on an external object, such as a kasina, an instrument, an external object that you focus upon, such as a coloured disc. But the key aspect of Samadhi is that it is the increased unification of consciousness, and is usually seen as an increased interiorization, the turning of consciousness inward upon itself. It's for this reason that Mircea Eliade, the scholar of Indian traditions, in his, I think, late 50s book, maybe it was late 50s, early 60s, but it was his PhD thesis originally, Mircea Eliade's book, Yoga, Immortality and Freedom, he coined the term ecstasy, meaning not ecstasy, which literally means standing outside yourself, but ecstasy, which means standing within. And the opposite of ecstasy, which is a kind of ecstatic, heightened excitement, hyperactive state, to ecstasy, which is about calmness and centeredness. And of course, if you look at the early Buddhist literature, you'll find that there's an outline of 8, sometimes 9 states of concentration called jhanas. Sometimes there are 4, but it depends on the text and the tradition. And as I said, these are states of increasing subtlety. The more concentrated consciousness is, the more subtle one's perception of the cosmos, traditionally speaking. Now, in the context in which I've represented it, Samadhi then is usually seen as an aid in the cultivation of mindfulness. You train the mind to concentrate so that it can sit on something and pay attention. Now, the word sati, the word that we're translating as mindfulness, literally means memory or remembrance. So in the Hindu tradition, they make a distinction in the Hindu tradition between what we call Smrti, which is literally that which is heard, which is the sacred revelation of the Vedas for members of that tradition, and what they call Smrti, which are the remembered traditions, the epic folk tales, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana being key Hindu examples of that. Now, within the classic mainstream Buddhist tradition, within that literature, the term isn't used obviously to mean remembered traditions in the Hindu sense. It's not used that way, but it's used to denote a state of sustained attention. Smriti is a holding in the mind of whatever it is you're perceiving, a deepened awareness of reality. And one way to put this, though I want to problematize this a little, is mindfulness of the present. Being present to your experience is a key aspect of this dimension. Now, Vipassana, the mindfulness path of insight, is traditionally understood to involve a greater awareness of the nature of existence. You're paying attention to existence, and therefore, from a Buddhist point of view, of a greater awareness and understanding of the Four Noble Truths. That is, as I will translate it here, although as has been mentioned, there are problems with this: suffering and anxiety, its cause, its end, and the path to achieve that end. And of course, anyone who knows anything about Buddhist teachings knows that the central idea here is that all things that exist have 3 fundamental characteristics. Dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness or the sense that they might lead to suffering and distress. Anitya, the impermanence of all things. And anatman, the fact that all things that come into existence are composites, they are compounded, and have no permanent unitary essence or intrinsic self. This was a key aspect of the Buddha's teaching. So Vipassana deepens one's understanding of the Four Noble Truths. That's how it's meant to work. You become more aware of the complexity of your experience, of the bundled nature of the things that you take otherwise to be simple unities, including your sense of self. Now, traditionally, of course, the Buddhist tradition is quite varied and across different nations and cultures and languages, and so there will be considerable variety. But traditionally, focusing upon the early Indian context, I'm going to talk about something called the Abhidharma, which is the kind of intellectual tradition of South Asian Buddhism. The cultivation of Sati or Smrti or mindfulness, if we want to call it that in English, encourages a presence of mind, as I've mentioned, but it also involves the cultivation of a word in Sanskrit which is prajna, or in Pali panya, which is often translated into English as wisdom, but in these kinds of contexts I find it more appropriate to translate it more technically as analytical insight. It's the insight into something which analyzes it into its component parts. In other words, you see through the superficial unities of things into their inner complexity. That's what analytical insight is about, and that's what the practice of mindfulness would cultivate and exercise. And it also clearly has traditionally been involved reflection upon the causal network of one's mental states. Sometimes mindfulness is represented as simply watching what goes on, observing your experience. But there's a considerable literature in Buddhism which emphasizes that this isn't just a watching, this is also a reflection upon the cause of that experience. Where does that feeling or that experience come from? What causes it? And what causes it to cease to be, and what follows it? So you are observing, but you are observing in an analytic framework. And of course, the other dimension of traditional Buddhist meditation is the encouragement of the wholesome, focusing, remembering the ethical precepts by which the guidelines for living one's life, discouraging states of hate, anger and greed, not pushing them away, because mindfulness is about seeing them, observing them, but not necessarily encouraging them either, encouraging their opposite, encouraging the cultivation of compassion and kindness towards all beings. Now, I present things this way because I want to contrast this with some of the ways in which mindfulness is spoken about in modern Western secular contexts. But just very briefly, I want to make a note of the fact that the idea that one practices mindfulness in separation from those other concentration practices is a fairly modern idea. And scholars who focused upon this have focused upon the role of Burmese teachers in this context in the development of what's known as the insight-only movement. In Burma, we have a key figure here is Ledi Sayadaw. The Burmese, Myanmar as it's now called, were colonized by the British, and this was seen by some teachers, including Ledi Sayadaw, as a sign of the imminent and predicted demise of Buddhism, because of course within the Buddhist tradition everything is impermanent, including the institutions of Buddhism and the understanding of Buddhism. And so there was an anxiety that perhaps they were seeing the signs of this decline in their own lives. And so the question occurred to Ledi Sayadaw, how can I preserve and save Buddhist teachings in an era of decline, in an era of British colonial occupation? And the solution that he came up with was to extend the range of teaching, to teach the laity how to meditate. But of course, lay Buddhists, like lay people throughout the world, have lots of other things going on in their lives. They have jobs, they have families, they have lots of commitments. They can't necessarily devote their lives to the systematic practice of meditation in the way in which monks and nuns would be able to. Following on from this, his student Mahasi Sayadaw continued this practice, and he simplified some of Ledi Sayadaw's methods. And in particular, what he did was he dropped the arduous concentration-based practices, which generally take a long time to develop, and emphasized what became known as insight only. So people, lay members could go on retreat and have classes on insight-only meditation. And of course, this also attracted from mostly from the 50s onwards, a series of spiritual pilgrims from the West who would come and take these retreats, learn how to do this kind of meditation, and then some of them would take this back with them to the West and incorporate it not only into their own personal lives, but also sometimes into their own therapeutic practices. The method that Mahasi Sayadaw developed was called Shuddha Vipassana, or pure insight, or insight only. A key aspect in this process was the translation, obviously, the translation of terms, the representation of these terms. And a key figure here is the figure of Nyanaponika Thera, who was a German-born Theravada bhikkhu who was ordained in Sri Lanka. And he trained under Mahasi in Myanmar, or Burma as it was then, in 1952. And he published a very influential book in 1954 called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. Now, within that book, he places a particular emphasis upon a representation of mindfulness as, he calls it, bare attention. It's the bare attention to your experience, the kind of shutting down of the conceptual apparatus of your mind to pay attention to what is actually presenting itself to you. This has been very influential in the way in which mindfulness has entered the Western mindset. A key figure here has been John Kabat-Zinn, who is a emeritus professor at Harvard. He's a medical professor. And this is how Kabat-Zinn describes mindfulness. He coined this term mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was a kind of therapeutic method that there's now is basically, in its different forms, the kind that has gone global. Kabat-Zinn says the following about mindfulness. It is, quote, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now, he uses this often. It's his kind of catchphrase definition of mindfulness. And I want to focus upon the fact that, on the one hand, of course, he emphasizes the present moment, but he also emphasizes the fact that the non-judgmental aspect of this process. And what I want to suggest is that whether Kabat-Zinn intends this or not, this representation of mindfulness downplays both the traditional analysis of the present moment in terms of its causal history, where it's coming from. In other words, it downgrades the analytic dimension of the mindfulness process, and the non-judgmental emphasis can have the unfortunate effect of also bracketing out the ethical dimension of mindfulness practice. That is the sense of mindfulness practice which is about encouraging the ethically wholesome. You should step back and just non-judgmentally observe what you experience and not be so tough on yourself, is what Kabat-Zinn suggests. In other instances, he goes even further. We have an interesting move in this quote from Kabat-Zinn. Mindfulness, the heart of Buddhist meditation, is at the core of being able to live life as if it really matters. It has nothing to do with Buddhism. It has to do with freedom. So we have a double move in the space of 2 sentences here. The first statement is that mindfulness is the core, it's the heart of Buddhist meditation. But the second sentence says that mindfulness is actually nothing to do with Buddhism. In other words, you can take that core out of Buddhism and you don't need the Buddhism. You can kind of put that on the side and just have the practice. Because here mindfulness has become a portable psychological technique that is represented as having no links to a particular ethical system or a particular set of institutions or a particular community or a particular cosmology of understanding of the universe. And this is one of the things that has made mindfulness so portable, so adaptable in this context. But it raises some important issues about what is being taught and the relationship of that to what it claims to have come from. Because, of course, Kabat-Zinn uses the exotic authority of Buddhism, that it's 2,500 years old, these practices, that the Buddha, the Buddha is, everyone thinks the Buddha's a great guy, even if you're not a Buddhist. So he can take the authority from that at the same point at which he disavows the institution and the community and the culture of it by saying, well, actually, you can do this without any Buddhist connection because it's about freedom. Now, I just want to briefly bring in here a Slovenian social critic, Slavoj Žižek, who has, in my view, a terrible understanding of the complexities of Buddhism. And actually, we can get into that, but he has the following statement, which I would just want to reflect upon. New Age Asiatic thought, which in its different guises, ranging from Western Buddhism to different Taos, is establishing itself as the hegemonic ideology of global capitalism. The Western Buddhist meditative stance is arguably the most efficient way for us to fully participate in capitalist dynamics while retaining the appearance of mental sanity. If Max Weber, a famous sociologist of religion, were alive today, he would definitely write a second supplementary volume to his Protestant ethic, entitled The Taoist Ethic and the Spirit of Global Capitalism. Now, Zizek, I think, here is both catastrophically wrong and has a point, in that his use of labels reflects the fact that he can't distinguish between the different kinds of Buddhism because he's not an expert and he doesn't show that much interest in finding out. But he is capturing something about the way in which certain practices and certain ideologies or teachings that are being linked to ostensibly Buddhist practices have become or are potentially very efficient strategies for placating workers, for selling products, for de-stressing people who are overworked in difficult working conditions and then can get back to work. In other words, this kind of non-judgmental, you don't engage critically with the structure of the environment that you're in, you just work on yourself approach to Buddhist meditation. I think he's picking up something here, that this works very well. It's very fluid, particularly because this kind of practice, because it doesn't have to be associated with particular Buddhisms or particular traditions, can therefore be deployed in all kinds of different contexts. But of course, it's not the whole story, and I think that Buddhists would quite rightly attack Zizek for his representation of all of this in terms of Buddhism or even Western Buddhism. So to contrast this, because I think there's something going on, as part of my central argument here, is there's something going on in the representation of mindfulness, which is a reaction to our contemporary moment in history. And our contemporary moment in history is we're living in an era of the globalization of capitalism. We may be living in an era of some of its breakdowns, but we're certainly living in that period of time. So I want to look at another example, which of course is not representative of all Buddhists by any means, but which will give a different interpretation and angle. I want to talk briefly about Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen teacher who's now based in France, who founded the Order of Interbeing in 1966. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King. Sadly, he didn't get it, but at least he was nominated, and nominated by a very prestigious person. Now, he's said to have coined the term engaged Buddhism. That doesn't mean he was the first person to be an engaged Buddhist. I think there are people in this room who might challenge that idea. But certainly he's become associated with this idea of engaged Buddhism. For Thich Nhat Hanh, the practice of mindfulness is intrinsically linked to the idea of interbeing. As he says, through mindfulness we experience interbeing, which means everything is in everything else. And it's this idea of relationality, which is such a key aspect of Buddhist teaching. And for Thich Nhat Hanh, he's drawing here upon particularly Mahayana ideas of shunyata, of emptiness, of our dependently co-arisen nature, pratitya samutpada or paticca samuppada, our mutuality in our sense of who we are. And so mindfulness for Nhat Hanh is the awareness of our interbeing. And if you look at the writings about this, you can see three main aspects to this. The one aspect is the deconstruction, if you like, of the myth of independence. The images, beliefs and habitual actions that ground us in the idea of a separate ego self. Again, back to this idea of seeing through the unities to the complexities behind them. Secondly, it's a cultivation of awareness and the practice of our interdependence, a recognition of our interrelatedness. And a further implication of that in some of his writing is the idea of overcoming the dualisms, in particular seeing your enemy, whoever that might be, as inter-existing with you, therefore not wholly separate. If we look, for instance, at the way in which Thich Nhat Hanh interprets some traditional Buddhist ethics, this is his interpretation of the second precept of generosity, his engaged interpretation. So I'll read this quote out. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing and oppression, I vow to cultivate loving kindness and learn ways to work for the well-being of people, animals, plants and minerals. I vow to practice generosity by sharing my time, energy and material resources with those who are in real need. I am determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. I will respect the property of others, but I will prevent others from profiting from human suffering or the suffering of other species on earth. So this is very much a kind of engaged understanding of ethics. It's not just about your personal way you live your life. It's about thinking about the community of human beings and animals in general. Now, when you come to look at how Thich Nhat Hanh writes about mindfulness, and he writes about it a lot, sometimes this idea is very foregrounded in the writing. So as an example, I want to talk about the experience of eating chocolate. Now, according to Nhat Hanh's approach, a traditional approach to this would be you would eat the chocolate, you would interpret the sensations of it. You would be mindful of the sensations, the pleasures of the chocolate, maybe the bitterness of it if it's dark chocolate or whatever, and so you would be fully present to the experience. It's very much a kind of sensory emphasis. For Thich Nhat Hanh, taking this idea of analysing the experience, not just in terms of its direct, present to you sensory experiences, but also the past which leads into that present, the causes that cause that piece of chocolate to be able to be eaten by you. He argues that mindfulness involves being aware of the systems, economic systems of exploitation which bring that chocolate to your table. The history of plantations and slavery, and all of those aspects. So, in other words, in one very significant way, mindfulness becomes also a history lesson of your present experience, an awareness of that structured causal network. So when you eat chocolate now, from this kind of perspective, it's also about being aware of where that chocolate came from, and the history, in some cases, of oppression related to the production of that item, that commodity. So let me sum up in very briefly here. In this struggle to define mindfulness, where am I going here? What's this? There we go. Let's do it this way. Lance Cousins and Eric Brown have written about the idea of mindfulness only and how this practice emerges in late colonial Burma. I mentioned how part of this is the emphasis upon mindfulness as bare attention with the intellectual elements stripped away. Living in the moment is how that's often spoken about. But the unfortunate consequence of this in the translation into Western understandings of mindfulness is it tends to minimize the role of mental analysis and reflection and also ethical judgment within the mindfulness practice. So in the late 20th, early 21st century, the dominant way in which mindfulness is being represented is in secular context, downplays its Buddhist origins and its context. It adopts the practice primarily as a form of stress reduction therapy, rather than what mindfulness might traditionally arguably be about, which is deepening our awareness of dukkha, rather than distracting us from it. And also that this dominant characterization advocates a non-judgmental attitude, especially towards oneself. In contrast, within the engaged Buddhist movement, we see the emphasis upon the role of analytical insight, prajna to use the traditional Sanskrit, and cognitive reflection in the mindfulness practice. But also an extension of the range of ethical reflection to include the raising of political consciousness of social injustice around the world. Now, I want to argue that both of those are new developments. They're both doing something different to the traditional account. And they are both responses to the way globalisation has unfolded in the contemporary world, and in particular the global spread of capitalist consumerism. So you have a model or an understanding of mindfulness which essentially slots in very easily to a capitalist consumerist lifestyle. You kind of cut out the judgment, you cut out the response to the structural injustice of what you're dealing with, you focus upon the now. And we're always told to focus upon the now. Engaged Buddhism, which I personally, the engaged Buddhist interpretation, which I personally find much more appealing as an interpretation of the Buddhist teaching, the advantage of that approach is it draws upon this ancient tradition of focusing upon analytical insight, breaking unities down into their complexities and their causal relations, and therefore the cognitive dimension involved in mindfulness. but also the encouraging of the wholesome. Where that is different, and I don't think that traditions need to stay in the past, I think that innovations are interesting. Where it's different is the way it extends and deepens the understanding of ethics from a purely personal ethic to a political awareness of structural and social injustice, and the idea that one should engage with that and perhaps do something about that. Thank you very much.